September 26th, 1940, Southampton, England. The sky screamed. At precisely 4:15 p.m., the Luftwaffe returned dozens of Dornier de-17 bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109s, roared over the English Channel like a swarm of hornets. Below them lay the sprawling supermarine factory, the beating heart of Britain's fighter production. Inside, men and women worked side by side, riveting panels, sanding wings, and assembling the sleek, deadly shape of the supermarine Spitfire. When the air raid sirens began, some froze, others ran. Engineer Hubert Scott Payne, standing near the final assembly line, looked up just as the first bomb fell. It struck the far end of the plant, obliterating the paint shop in a burst of flame and steel. The shockwave shattered windows and hurled workers to the ground. Then came another, and another. By the time the all-clear sounded, the main Spitfire works at Woolston was gone, reduced to a smouldering skeleton of twisted girders and molten machinery. Nearly 100 workers were dead. Those who survived stood in stunned silence, watching the flames devour the very heart of British air power. At that moment, Britain was producing barely enough Spitfires to replace the losses in the sky. The Luftwaffe was relentless, and every burned-out frame was one less guardian of the island. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it a calamity of national defence. But as the smoke drifted over the ruined docks, Hubert Scott Payne, shipbuilder, engineer and lifelong tinkerer, refused to bow to despair. He turned to his surviving team and said, "If they've taken our factory, we'll build one they can't find." What he meant was madness and brilliance. That night, in a small pub lit by oil lamps and exhaustion, Scott Payne outlined his plan. "We scatter the work," he said. "No one place to bomb. A wing here, a cockpit there, a fuselage in a barn if we must. Every field, every village becomes part of the machine." The idea sounded impossible, but Britain had already learned to live with the impossible. As German reconnaissance planes photographed the blackened ruins of Woolston, the Nazis believed they had crippled the Royal Air Force. What they didn't know, what they would never realise, was that by destroying the factory, they had set in motion one of the greatest feats of improvisation in wartime history. The miracle of the shadow factories was about to begin. October 1940, Hampshire countryside. A pale dawn mist hung over the hedgerows as lorries rumbled down the narrow lanes, their tarpaulins hiding crates stamped with a single cryptic word: aircraft parts, priority. The destination wasn't an airfield or an industrial estate. It was a barn. Inside, beneath rafters still strung with drying hay, a handful of men uncrated what looked like pieces of sculpture: polished aluminum panels, curved spars, the unmistakable ribs of a wing. Farmer Thomas Avery, still in his mud-caked boots, watched as a technician from the Ministry of Aircraft Production laid out blueprints across his feed table. "Your barn's dry and away from the roads," the man explained. "That makes it a factory now." Avery scratched his head. "And what do I do when the cows want their space back?" "Then, Mr. Avery," the technician replied, smiling faintly, "you'll be building more than milk for Britain." The idea, known quietly as the Shadow Scheme, spread like wildfire through southern England. Supermarine engineers, displaced from bombed Southampton, set out across the countryside, turning village halls, garages, railway depots, schools, and even greenhouses into miniature aircraft workshops. One hamlet might produce wing spars, another landing gear. Housewives riveted cockpit panels while blacksmiths forged tail frames between shoeing horses. At night, lights were dimmed and engines muffled. Secrecy was everything. By day, the sky overhead hummed with the drone of distant bombers. By night, Britain hummed with defiance. In one converted coach house near Salisbury, 17-year-old apprentice Margaret Henshaw polished the nose cone of a Spitfire under the flicker of a kerosene lamp. "We used to joke," she later said, "that the Germans would never find our factory because it had a rooster on the roof and smelled of manure." The first completed sections rolled out in late October, carried under tarps to secret assembly points in unmarked lorries. At these hubs, makeshift airframe plants hidden among hedgerows, engineers bolted, riveted, and wired together what had been born in a dozen separate villages. Piece by piece, the Spitfire took shape. By November, the first of these rural-born Spitfires took flight from an airstrip near Chilbolton. It soared into the pale English sky, its engine purring like vengeance. The test pilot, grinning as he taxied to a stop, shouted over the wind, "She flies like she knows where she came from." Even the ministry officials, hardened by months of disaster, were astonished. One report read simply, "Production capacity restored and dispersed beyond destruction." While London burned under the Blitz, the lifeline of Britain's air defence now lay hidden in her farmlands. The Luftwaffe could level cities, but it could not bomb every barn in England. Hubert Scott Payne, travelling from site to site, watched this strange new industry bloom. He found old men shaping propeller spinners beside stables, children carrying rivets in tin pails, and women sewing flight upholstery beside milking stools. It was industry reborn in the most human way imaginable, fueled not by machinery, but by imagination. And from that imagination, the Spitfire lived again. Winter 1941, Wiltshire, England. Snow dusted the fields like powdered glass, and the roads were quiet save for the growl of engines. Convoys of lorries rolled by night without headlights, escorted by the occasional Home Guard patrol with rifles slung over their shoulders. Their cargo was priceless. Wing spars, carburetors, control surfaces, all bound for an unmarked hangar outside Salisbury Plain. From the air, nothing betrayed what was happening below. To Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots scanning through their camera lenses, the English countryside looked unchanged. Farms, hedgerows, country estates, the faint glimmer of village lights through blackout curtains. They had no idea that beneath that pastoral calm lay the most elaborate industrial camouflage in history. Inside a converted dairy shed, men and women worked through the cold. The rhythmic sound of hammers and drills filled the air, blending with the lowing of cattle outside. A calendar on the wall bore the slogan, "We fight with tools, not guns." One of the engineers, Arthur Llewellyn, paused to warm his hands over a small stove, then leaned back over a fuselage frame propped between sawhorses. "Hard to believe," he said quietly to a fellow worker, "that this bit of metal might save a pilot's life next week." At the same time, in another corner of England, an elderly blacksmith was forging engine brackets in the same forge his grandfather had once used for horseshoes. His apprentice kept time with the hammer blows, counting softly between strikes to ensure precision. Across the nation, hundreds of these small workshops beat in rhythm, a mechanical symphony hidden under the hum of war. By 1942, the decentralized network had become so efficient that it rivaled any industrial system in Europe. There were over 500 shadow facilities quietly contributing to the effort. Toolmakers in Oxfordshire, seamstresses in Surrey sewing cockpit covers, and even a monastery near Dorset that machined precision gauges between daily prayers. The Ministry of Aircraft Production coordinated this miracle with military precision. Couriers on motorcycles carried blueprints sealed in oilskin envelopes. Instructions were printed in cryptic code, so that if a single shipment was intercepted, it would mean nothing to the enemy. To ensure secrecy, each workshop built only a fraction of the Spitfire, often without knowing what it was for. A farmer might produce 5 flaps a month, never realizing that each one would soon belong to a fighter dueling the Luftwaffe over the Channel. Meanwhile, the Supermarine headquarters, now relocated to dispersed sites across southern England, assembled these fragments into complete aircraft. When the first mass-produced rural Spitfires rolled off the hidden lines, even the engineers who designed them were astonished at their quality. A test pilot, Group Captain Geoffrey Wellham, recalled his first flight in one of the barn-built machines. She climbed like a homesick angel, smooth as silk. You'd never guess she'd been born in a barn. Every Spitfire built this way carried something intangible in its rivets, a quiet defiance, a sense of shared purpose that no bomb could extinguish. The Luftwaffe, frustrated and confused, intensified its bombings on major industrial centres. Yet Spitfires continued to appear in the skies over Britain, faster than ever. German intelligence reports labelled it impossible, calling it the phantom production. By 1943, the impossible had a number, more than 10,000 Spitfires built in secrecy. And still the Germans never discovered the truth. Hubert Scott Payne visited one of the hidden workshops that spring. Standing at the doorway of a converted apple orchard, he watched a group of young apprentices polishing a newly finished wing under the afternoon sun. He smiled faintly and said to the foreman, "They thought they could bomb us into silence. All they did was make us whisper louder." Summer 1944. Somewhere in rural Kent, a golden haze hung over the fields, broken only by the glint of sunlight off aluminum. Beneath a camouflage net stretched between oak trees, a small team of engineers stood around a Spitfire fuselage balanced on wooden blocks. The air smelled of oil, grass, and determination. The barn-built production network had grown into something no enemy strategist could have conceived. A living, breathing organism of labour and secrecy. From Cornwall to Lincolnshire, over 30,000 men and women now worked in the hidden chain that fed Britain's aerial lifeline. Every hammer strike, every rivet, every shipment mattered. At dawn, convoys from scattered workshops converged on quiet airfields. Crates labelled farm machinery or agricultural supplies were unloaded by hand. But inside those crates were the wings of Spitfires, the skeletons of defiance. Mechanics in grease streak coveralls worked through the night to marry them into complete aircraft. When one young pilot, Flight Officer Alan Deere, visited a rural assembly site and asked where the plane had come from, a mechanic grinned and said, "Half from a cowshed, half from a school gymnasium, sir. All British." The miracle was not just industrial, it was personal. Housewives became welders, farmers became engineers, teenagers learned to drill rivets by hand. Even elderly craftsmen, too old for military service, found purpose again in shaping propeller blades or testing hydraulics. One foreman joked, "If you can hold a hammer or boil tea, you're in production." By the end of 1944, the results were astonishing. The decentralized shadow factory system had produced over 20,000 Spitfires, not in vast industrial complexes, but in an invisible network of barns, sheds, schools, and back rooms. Each aircraft represented hundreds of unseen hands. Each rivet a quiet act of rebellion. The Luftwaffe, desperate to halt the flood of fighters, intensified its bombing campaign, but their intelligence remained blind. They targeted empty fields and quiet villages, never realizing the truth. Britain itself had become one enormous factory. When the war finally turned in Europe's favour, it was not only because of Spitfires in the sky, it was because of the spirit on the ground. In May 1945, as the bells of victory rang out, Hubert Scott Payne visited one of the barns where the first rural-built Spitfire had been completed. The war was over, the tools were silent, but sunlight still gleamed off a spare wing left resting against a hay bale. He ran his hand along the smooth metal and whispered, almost to himself, "They'll never know where half of these came from." And that's how we won. The Spitfire had not just been an aircraft, it was a national covenant. A promise hammered and riveted by a people who refused to yield. And so, while the Luftwaffe believed they had destroyed Britain's capacity to fight, they had, in truth, created its greatest weapon, not the Spitfire itself, but the unity that built it.